Good evening, everybody out there in the world beyond. Thank you for joining us this evening and for this amazing film that we just screened, Gather. And to start off the conversation, I'd like to introduce Sanjay Rawal, the director of the film, who's back with us here in Salt Lake virtually. He was here with us, I think, in 2014 with one of his earlier films called Food Chains. And then I'd also like to introduce Lila Crank, who's the program assistant at the, oh my goodness, this is the embarrassing part of being online. I'm so sorry. I told you at the First Nations Development Institute. I'm sorry, Lila. Lila's also Navajo from Southern Utah. So thank you so much to both of you for joining us this evening. And you know, what an amazing film and amazing stories. I have to say off the bat that there's so many things to discuss in this film, but I would like to start off, Sanjay, just to touch base with you to maybe give us a little update on where everybody is these days. You know, I know there were, as I said, there were updates like just after the film, but that was, as you mentioned, a few months ago. So it'd be great to maybe get a sense of where people are today.
Yeah, well, Patrick, to those out there watching the Q&A who watched the film, thank you so very, very, very much. You know, we actually completely finished the film and put it, you know, on drives, so to speak, about 3 days before New York City locked down in March. I'm based in Queens. And it took a little bit longer for the tribal areas where we filmed to start really facing the brunt of the pandemic the way we did first in New York City. So Nephi kept his, you know, operations going to some effect until about April, when the White Mountain Apache Reservation really hit the same per capita numbers as the more publicized tragedy on the Navajo Nation. We actually filmed his soft open in late January of 2020. So it wasn't like we filmed it in 2017 or 2018.
Okay.
We were really just waiting for him to like open. So he's shuttered. He doesn't have to pay rent because it's tribal property, and they've continued their own cooking and training classes. He's actually on Instagram, and people can cook with them every Wednesday night via his Instagram Live. Twyla Cazador on the San Carlos Apache Reservation, they had kind of more pervasive COVID lockdowns. It was really horrific, and I know Lila will get into it more, but all of these reservations are pretty much at the end of supply chains, you know, and actually they're miles away from the end of supply chains. They're in areas where people sometimes have to drive 40, 50, 60, 100 miles to get to poorly stocked grocery stores. And when the pandemic hit, those last sections of the supply chain weren't being stocked the way they were in Salt Lake City or New York City or San Francisco. And so Twyla and her family really had to scramble, and they really relied on traditional food sources. And her education sessions became much, much, much more important for the long-term health of her community. On the Klamath River, the Yurok tribe, the ancestral guard, and their kind of advocacy with other tribes on the Klamath River, the Kuruk tribe, the Hupa tribes, resulted in a massive success about 10 days ago when the governors of California and Oregon and the Pacific Energy Corporation, which owns the 4 dams up the Klamath River, finally agreed after 2 decades to terms to demolish those 4 dams, which is the largest dam demolition project in American history. And lastly, Elsie Dubray, she's now, believe it or not, she's a junior. She just entered her junior year in September, but you know, rather than try to do her chemistry classes remotely, obviously impossible, she's deferred this semester. She's going to kind of make it up next summer. She's been living at home on the Cheyenne River Lakota Reservation, studying Lakota language and helping her dad out on their buffalo ranch. Patrick, you're muted.
I did exactly what we said. Josh warned us not to do. I did it. My apologies. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that, thank you for that, Sanjay. It's so hard to really understand what, challenges are being faced, and then on all of the Native communities. As we hear a lot in the news in Utah about the Navajo Nation and the challenges down south. Lila, can you tell us a little bit about your work with the First Nations Institute, and how you're not only involved maybe in supporting the food idea of food sovereignty, but with any other information about what's happening on the reservation or in Native communities currently?
Yeah, sure. So roughly, I work for the Native Agriculture and Food Systems Initiative, and we have a bunch of different grants that we get from a bunch of different funders, and they have different focuses, and we give out those grants to a bunch of people each, maybe every like 2-3 years. And those all have Native food systems focuses. This year was a little bit different. Because of COVID. And we sort of had to, it's like as soon as it started in late March, early April, there was it hit our communities really hard and really quickly. Like it came out of nowhere for us. And in a matter of days, we had just this giant exponential growth. And because we're at the bottom of the food systems, and also we have very little infrastructure often on reservations, so we at First Nations were really scrambling together to get food, get money, get resources out to these communities. And so what we originally started doing was actually getting meat and fresh produce down to these communities. Later, we realized that if we could stop being the bridge and allow that like the producers and the tribes to sort of have that direct contact. And instead, we've sort of grown into the role of giving resources through our COVID grants. So far, we've given about $2.5 million to through about 200 COVID grants to tribes and organizations around Indian country who are responding to the needs of Native people that have like the issues that are usually in Native country, like being at the bottom of the food systems chain, have been exacerbated. So what we're trying to do is ensure that they get the food that they need. Right now in my community, so like at the beginning of the pandemic, we were completely locked down, and my family has to travel about 100 miles to get to the nearest grocery store. And we could not, we just didn't have the resources. So my family got, because of the amazing people on the Navajo Res who are, I mean, these are things that happen across Indian country where our people start taking care of our own people. We got fresh produce and fresh meat handed out to Navajo Nation in many different spots, including the Navajo part, or the Navajo part of, or the Utah part of Navajo. So that's sort of what First Nations was doing with, and that's what we're currently doing right now. The reservations are looking very similar to how they looked at the beginning of April. The cases are continuing to grow exponentially and even worse than at the beginning, especially in the Midwest. And so First Nations is really focusing on those hotspots as we give our COVID grants out every 2 weeks or so.
So while we're on that topic, Lila, like I want to ask, and so we have time to cover it, what can people who are watching, is there any way for our viewers to support your efforts, like the First Nations Development Institute's efforts to help the Indian country and the different tribes? Is there ways that we can be supportive?
Absolutely, definitely. So, one of the biggest and best ways you can be supportive is to donate to our COVID relief fund. So, if you go to our website at firstnations.org, there's a big donate button, and you can specifically select a section that says for COVID relief grants. Any amount is, sorry about this, any amount is, $1, whatever, it's all going towards helping this community. Any amount is so important. And you can also just follow us on our social medias, support our posts, boost what we're doing. You can go to first FN. So on Instagram, our handle is FNDI303. And if you, share posts to your stories or share what we're doing with COVID grant making to your Facebook, anything like that, that's also super helpful.
Thank you. We'll put some of those URLs in those sort of your Instagram handles in our chat so people can access it. Hopefully people will support and provide assistance, but to the best of their abilities. I have to just, on a personal note, the ongoing, I'm so moved by the stories, and it's tragic and heartbreaking, all at the same, it's just overwhelming. So I can't imagine how it's for residents. I'm really at a loss for words to describe how it makes me feel. It's unconscionable in my mind, but we do have some questions coming in from the audience at this point. I want to start off. Noel asks, for you, Sanjay, what inspired you to make this film?
It's a great question.
By the way, he also says fabulous, bravo, and what inspired you?
Thank you. Well, a little bit of history. The very first documentary was made in 1929 by an Anglo-American filmmaker named Robert Flaherty. It's called Nanook of the North, and it was made about an Inuit man and the traditional hunting styles and life ways of those people. And by all accounts, it was done with full participation of the folks that were in the film. But what that did was it spawned an industry where people like me that can afford a camera would bomb into exotic locations around the world and film folks. Some of those films were done in partnership with communities, others weren't. But what it has resulted in is that Indigenous children around the world tend to learn about their own cultures through media that's not been created by Indigenous people. And it's a way that, the kind of like pernicious stereotypes that we see all over Hollywood, all over media, particularly the romanticizing, the kind of just discriminatory viewpoints towards Native Americans keep getting reinforced. So with a topic like food sovereignty, I kind of knew better than to launch into this on my own. A kind of common friend of both myself and the First Nations Development Institute kind of paired us together and said, hey, do you guys want to make a film about this? Like, Sanjay can make the film, but First Nations, you guys can make sure he doesn't mess up. And on my part, I know that there's more than 570 federally recognized Native tribes with their own sovereign land, their own traditions, their own cultures, often their own language, hundreds of more that don't have that kind of political stamp of recognition. So it was daunting for me to think like making a film about food sovereignty with a demographic that's not identical. We call them Native Americans, but they're Apache, they're Navajo, they're Ute, etc. It would be impossible. And I would have to spend years, if not decades, trying to like build trust within single communities. And so First Nations really stepped up and they made introductions to people, eventually the folks in the film that have had relationships with them for years, if not longer. And so I basically got introductions into communities and got kind of stamps of approval that most non-natives would never get, and those that have worked and kind of earned it in a way I did it. So in my standpoint, I was given such access. And so I just felt this tremendous pressure not to screw it all up.
You'd think I'd have the Zoom figured out by now. But I think the three, I think the three stories and three like groups that you followed really encapsulate, the agrarian, the plains with, buffalo, bison being the main food source, and then, the fishing, an ocean or water focused tribe. I think that it's really nice, brings that broad-based stories together, because as you said, it's not a monolithic culture, even if we think that.
And like it's important to note that prior to 1860, the majority of the global economy was based on land. It was based on soil. When the first Anglo-Americans came to, or Anglo-Europeans came to the New World, Turtle Island, really, to the United States, or what became the United States, unlike the Spanish, who were looking for mountains of gold, the Anglo-Europeans realized that the value was in the land. And they set up monocropped farms to export cash crops, tobacco, cotton, etc. Those of us who studied anything in school were taught that eastern seaboard was wild, but it was an interconnected set of meticulously stewarded ecosystems, agricultural ecosystems, hunting, foraging, harvesting, fishing, and it was just literally the embodiment of Judeo-Christian visions of heaven. And it was quickly exploited for the power that the natives had created in the soil. Obviously, euphemistically, Native Americans proved to be terrible enslaved people because they knew the land better than the settlers and would escape. And so the colonial economy went to Africa, specifically to agrarian communities, and began to enslave people there. And that push westward, again, economically, settlers, immigrants who wanted to participate, to develop wealth, they needed land because there was really no way to participate other than being just a worker. If you wanted to set out and create your own destiny, so to speak, you needed a big plot of land. And the US military would push for that because all of the goods grown out on the frontier would all be shipped back to cities to feed the growing population of, Americans and the immigrants that were coming in. So, we wanted to make a film about this whole phenomenon, but much of it happened before the advent of photography. And so we really needed to focus on tribal communities that essentially were west of the Mississippi, that faced the brunt of the US military post-Civil War, as opposed to pre-Civil War when there wasn't the kind of camera technology. So we had an academic focus. We wanted to do something that really encompassed all of Turtle Island and the history of the entire colonization, which is why we had that little fragment towards the end of Danielle Hill from Mashpee, Wampanoag territory.
I think that piece and the connectivity that they had in that, between tribes from different coasts was really, really moving and powerful way to end the film. I get this one's, I think, for you, Lila. It's more focused on food and food availability. It says, Tony asks, how does it feel that the majority of food in the market is controlled by a few mega corporations HQ'd overseas? And does that, that sort of macro, sort of high level of, multinational food conglomerate have how does that impact native communities in Indian country?
Sure. Well, it impacts it in the way that we're used to, outside of Indian country, we're used to maybe grocery stores around every corner, and we see Walmarts and we see Safeways or we see Trader Joe's. And so all of those giant corporations that we're used to seeing all over the place, that's not commonplace in most places in Indian country, at least in my community. So this is to kind of put it into perspective. Like on the Navajo reservation is about 27,000 square miles, and that's about the size of West Virginia, actually a little bit bigger. In West Virginia, there are 48 Walmart supercenters alone, not including any other grocery store. And on the Navajo Nation, there are 10 grocery stores in total. So when you have these giant corporations, they sort of act in the same way that the rest of the United States act. And they really only go to places where there's a lot of attention. And often there's not a lot of attention. There's not a lot of, there's rarely any good, strong food systems infrastructure that has to do with corporations in Native communities. And that's why we have to sort of use traditional ways and our own resources and build within our community our own food systems, because we don't get the infrastructure of outside giant corporations in our communities.
Similar, that kind of plays on that. That's from Tony as well. Does, you know, as you're looking and working with traditional food, you know, and food sovereignty, like major corporations like Monsanto and others, you know, are creating GMOs and, you know, seeds and patenting seed technology and stuff like that. I mean, does that have an impact at all on Native communities as well, and Native farming?
I'm not sure. I can't really speak to that. Sanjay, do you have any knowledge about that?
Yeah, you know, from a progressive standpoint outside of Indian country, we tend to focus on corporate control. But as it happens, the issues in Indian country are so much more fundamental. Like there is no such thing as the free market in Indian country, because the land itself is technically owned still by the federal government. Native Americans are really legally just occupants of that land. And what that means is that there's a whole system of bureaucracy to get permitting to grow things traditionally. It's almost impossible to actually feed Native kids food grown on reservations that don't pass through the USDA supply chain. And a lot of that is actually by design. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was set up in the 1840s to regulate all aspects of Indian life. This was almost 100 years prior to the development of USDA, which happened around the time of the Great Depression. Natives, since they don't own their land, they're not allowed to own their land even as individuals. They don't have access to capital the way Western farmers do. They can't actually build up the kind of conglomerates that we decry in the more conventional agricultural sense. So yeah, like, you know, there's a long history of theft of native germplasm. In fact, Monsanto's own, you know, Roundup Ready corn is directly related to gifts of corn that the Mohawk, the Haudenosaunee people gave to scientists in the, you know, 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And, you know, a lot of that genetically modified material has its roots in native science. Obviously, it's been thrown into a capitalist system and not necessarily in the same mode of exchange. But really, to answer the question, native issues are much more fundamental. Like they're fighting for access to market. The kind of vagaries of monopolistic control of markets and spaces is like so many decades ahead of where they need to be. And again, it's by design. Like the federal government sets up these programs so that Native communities continue their reliance on food rations, et cetera.
So just so I understand, just to clarify, I don't know, like there's a lot to unpack there, but so in Native communities, Native farmers and the agricultural sort of cooperatives or agricultural groups aren't able to access the same farming subsidies and support that, you know, non-Native agriculture and farmers are able to access?
So there's a whole element of the economy, basically, that's known as the agricultural finance system. But deeper than that. There's an actual structural inability for tribal people to control their own lands because they're considered occupants. They're considered wards of the state. The
That's
Indian
what
Affairs
that's yeah.
Department was set up under the War Department in the 1800s, and then it was shifted to the Department of the Interior in the mid 1840s, the late 1840s. I mean, it was meant to address everything, including like food and agricultural practices. And this body has complete jurisdiction over Native American agriculture. The USDA, which has a much, much, much bigger budget, is focused on everything else. The USDA is what has, crop subsidies, has loans, has other programs for non-native farmers. But the whole idea was to treat enemy tribes as prisoners of war and put them on reservations. And tribes didn't necessarily like that. So the US government instituted the idea of agriculture in the hopes of making them settle in one place. It worked for some and it didn't, but there was this blanket policy that was meant to try to control all the tribal communities, some of which were agriculturally based, some of which weren't. But the vast majority of Native Americans aren't included in the systems that help to create wealth within farming systems. That's why you don't see Native American products in stores. Like, it takes a lot of like external investment that comes outside of communities or from casinos to be able to create the kind of capital that any business needs. I mean, any non-native can apply to the USDA for loans or for grants. I mean, I have a friend whose friend decided he wanted to live in rural America and set up a farm. He was able to apply for a grant to build a house in rural America and got that grant, not a loan, got that grant through the USDA. There's a whole system of programs that our tax dollars pay for that don't address any needs in Indian country right now.
I think I'm going to be a little sick. I'm a little sick to my stomach, to be perfectly honest. I know that that's a very could be a common reaction, but I mean, this is new information for me, so I'm absorbing it as it comes. I can't even get my head around that, I have to say. We have a sorry, go ahead, Sanjay.
The other thing to throw in there is that because native land was so coveted, both for the development of cities on the East Coast and then for prime farming land, Native Americans, with the exception of some communities like the Navajo, the Hopi, the Pueblos, they were displaced from their original lands to basically unfarmable land or areas that were downriver from places where the Army Corps of Engineers ended up building dams. The kind of interesting thing about it is a lot of that unfarmable land that folks were moved to in the 1800s turned out to be rich in petroleum. 19. But that's all to say. And at the same time, as railroads were being built, Native tribes were pushed away from those railroads, which became the backbones for the supply chains. I mean, all the highway systems are really built on railway systems, which is why there's great east-west highways and terrible north-south, because all of the goods are being transported from the west to the east. So Native Americans and Indian country was designed to be as far away from supply chains as possible. And that's not just an issue in terms of getting things to Indian country. I have friends who are cattle ranchers on the Navajo reservation, kind of in the Sanders area, and they harvest their cattle in a completely sustainable way. They've got thousands of acres. The cattle just are free range. They're not digging up the ground the way they do in normal fields. They're not feedlot cattle, but these farmers can't actually harvest their cattle for Navajo kids in schools because they don't have a slaughterhouse. And there's no way for them to get the investment, the hundreds of thousands of dollars needed to build a slaughterhouse on tribal territory because they don't have access to USDA grants. So they basically grow their cattle, ship them to a slaughterhouse, and a distributor buys from the slaughterhouse and basically trucks things to a 30, 40-mile radius of that slaughterhouse, which is a good 400 to 600 miles away from the actual reservation. So the supply chain stops in Indian country, but in order to sell products and make money, natives often have to ship those products out of Indian country.
Wow.
Patrick,
Okay.
hang with us. There's a lot of hope. There's a lot of hope.
That's good. That's good because it's. I mean, that's what I was gonna go to next. Is that it's just that there's the inequity is like unfathomable, and I was curious, and this kind of ties into another question we have. I mean, and Lila, this could be for you. George asked about, are you getting support from the government in terms of COVID grants or grant support from the government to support tribal nations? Are you receiving any government assistance beyond what what Sanjay kind of just touched on about being wards of the state? I mean, it's just crazy.
So I can speak to what we've done at First Nations. Short answer, not really. So what we actually have, like a contracted person who has to sift through all of the different grants and all of the different opportunities for like agriculture grants for native or for just anybody provided by the USDA or things from nonprofits. So we have a specific person who is contracted to look for these opportunities. There's no one knocking on our door asking us if we need these opportunities or presenting them to us from the government. We have to search really, really hard for opportunities for our native farmers or our native people to get grants from the government. Recently, some communities have gotten money from the government to give out some COVID relief stipends, but that is effective to the point of like people are just sort of barely surviving in many of these communities. And so really at First Nations, we don't get that support of the government. Sanjay, do you have anything else that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, this was a big fight when a lot of the COVID relief in that first package was portioned out. States got money pretty quickly, but tribes were fighting for 4 to 6 weeks to get money that was promised by Congress. The Treasury, just for whatever reason, didn't wire the money to tribal governments. Again, a lot of that is, it sounds like conspiracy theory, but when you look back at the history of America, like it's the norm. I mean, furthermore, by treaty, a lot of tribes were guaranteed food allotments from the country. Like on the Navajo res, there are actually like US government funded supply points where people can go in and get groceries. And that's because the US government is, even though the Navajo reservation, as Lila mentioned, is bigger than West Virginia, it's not nearly as big as the original size. And for a lot of reasons that are kind of too complicated to get into, because of literally theft of their land, the government promised them a whole series of future access to goods. And that's the case with a lot of treaties. But when the supply chain began breaking down, the US government didn't fund the last mile delivery to fulfill treaty obligations. What ends up happening is once every decade or so, there ends up being a massive class action suit by dozens, if not hundreds of native tribes against the US government. More often than not, the first set of judges penalize the US government tens of billions of dollars. And more often than not, the US government through the executive branch, and this happened under Bush, Obama as well, the executive branch doesn't pay out and native plaintiffs began dying. And so the lawyers representing those plaintiffs say, we should just come away with something. So a lot of these issues are settled in the courts, but at the end of the day, when the executive branch that controls the Treasury has the power, is not going to be imprisoned for not executing that power, Indian country faces the consequences.
Wow. I have more questions, but I kind of would like to go to the hope that we have, that especially seeing you know, the stories that you shared with us in the film, and particularly the younger generation, you know, with Sammy and Elise and you, Lila, you know, taking these steps and you know, working to affect change. Like, I mean, is it really from my impression from the film, and is it primarily a youth movement to reconnect with native food, native agriculture and community agriculture, or is it, you know, does it cross generations? I know it's hard to generalize, but I'm just wondering, you know, is there a gap? You know, are people who are in their, you know, sort of between the ages of 40 and 80, are they not? They don't. Do they have a similar perspective, or are they? Or do they think differently about these types of efforts?
Sure. So from my experience, you know, I can speak to something that I think kind of answers your question. So I got to, you know, we give out scholarships to people who want to like work in agriculture. So recently we gave out a scholarship to people who are in higher education, to natives who are in higher education who want to work in agriculture or do something for food sovereignty in their communities or other tribal communities. We got applications from people who were pursuing their degrees when they were like in their 70s.
Wow,
And
amazing.
yeah, so it's, you know, from my perspective and from my community, it's everyone usually wants to be in there. I mean, and everyone has some connection to wanting to develop food systems or food sovereignty in our communities. And I think the youth now have more access to things like social media. So we have more, maybe more networking ability than generations before. But I would say that across the board, we do have elders in our community who are pursuing degrees late in their much later years because they want to be part of developing sovereignty.
Wonderful. But I mean, I think it's great to hear that there's that cross generational, you know, approach, and that people are getting involved, you know, from all aspects of the community. Sanjay, is there anything you want to add? You'd like to add to that, or to give us some other hopeful info or background?
Yeah, you know, I'm gonna share what Sammy Gensoff from the Yurok tribe shares, and I'll frame it by, you know, it's like I've had a chance to spend time near where Lila grew up on the, you know, the areas of Blanding, Bluff, Mexican Hat, you know, running with a group of Native American friends to Bears Ears, and heard plenty of stories from elders there, not just stories about how they were effectively shot by non-native residents of those counties, shot with rifles because these elders had been advocating for the protection of sacred Navajo sites, which are now part of the Bears Ears National Monument. So Sammy Gensoff, he points out, and this I think is pretty much a truth in America, that some of the most racist places in America are the towns bordering reservations. Why is that? Settlers who came to those regions either had direct violent relationships with natives, that they uprooted natives, they killed natives, or they came in directly after the US Army did that sort of ethnic cleansing for them. Now, you know, it's these immigrants, these settlers were acting with a tremendous amount of self-interest. They were trying to establish the roots of their families. More often than not, they were coming from deeply impoverished backgrounds as well. They were coming from far off countries. Some weren't entirely cognizant. Some were so steeped in religious beliefs that they felt justified these acts of violence. What Sammy says, and he said this clearly in an interview, which wasn't in the film, he said, the trauma that his generation faces directly stems from those acts of violence. But the trauma that the current descendants of those settlers also have in their heart, the insecurity, the anger, the animosity, the things that are pushing them away from happiness, also comes from that moment of violence. Nobody living today is directly responsible for the horrors of the past. That said, each side carries part of that trauma. Their trauma stems from the same set of incidences. And Sammy says, it's now time to come to the table, talk about what happened in the past, talk about how we need to come together and understand what happened and what we need to do right now to go forward. But the problem is those conversations aren't happening. And the people in these equations that actually have the physical power, that have the backing of government resources and institutions, are those people who descended from those settlers. And Sammy would argue that the pain in their hearts, or the darkness in their hearts that's haunting them, is much more fundamental than the trauma that natives face. Natives still have their connection to the land. They still have their connection to their creator, their creation stories. But the people on the other side, they're not connected to anything that can give them happiness. And in Sammy's viewpoint, that makes him tremendously sad. And so he feels, although he knows it's not his responsibility to offer an olive branch, he feels a humanity. He feels a humanity that the other side needs and he knows doesn't have. So that gives me hope when I see people who have no reason to be hopeful, no reason to want to reconcile, actually actively understanding that the reconciliation needs to happen for the other side. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful sentiment that I see across Indian youth. And there are people coming to the table. I've seen it with Gather. There are a lot of people that are recognizing their family's direct or indirect role in the violence of the past. And they're looking for ways, whether it's as simple as giving a few dollars to First Nations, whether they live in communities and can actually begin supporting tribal policies, or those of us like myself, first generation American, I live in New York City. I know that there were Native stewards here. The tribal presence here is not nearly as visible as it would be in the Southwest, but I can ask myself, with the tribal communities that are within the vicinity of the tri-state area, what policies are they trying to push that my own political or economic power could help? Because I understand that their view of this land, their love of this land is much deeper and will last much longer than my presence here will. And we've all screwed up our own relationship with this country enough, such that I feel a duty to allow those who actually consider themselves stewards of this land to have places at the table. So there's a little bit of that reconciliation that can happen with all of us, but really that reconciliation is being pushed by Native people. And it's a tremendously inspiring act of humanity.
It really is. That's remarkable. I mean, it's just that philosophical outlook is really amazing. It's kind of my anyways. You kind of touched on what Noel was going to ask about as an urbanite and how we could bridge the gap. So I think that researching and looking into what kind of efforts native communities are making in your area, whether it's an urban area, rural, or in between, I think and getting involved however you possibly can, I think is a good way to look at that, as Noel asked. So I have a few questions about specifically about Buffalo, which I might hold to the end. So all those of you who are sending those in, we'll touch on that as we get closer. But one of the other questions that that George asked about Indian country and tribal lands is that is sovereign native countries subject to the same federal taxes as cities and counties? Or is there, because it's federal land, how different is that treated?
I mean, that's a great question. Every single Native individual is subject to federal income taxes. As sovereign entities, tribal governments, they have the power to levy taxes on reservation lands on their own people. Some do, some don't. So there is sales tax on goods. There's some sales taxes on services. But again, it's like cities don't pay federal income tax. States don't pay federal income tax. Federal income tax happens on the level of the individual. And every Native American is a citizen. So every Native American is required to pay federal income taxes. I mean, that's the interesting thing about what sovereignty actually means. Sovereignty from a tax perspective allows Native tribes to levy taxes on their own people the way a city would, which is, in a sense, a government or a judicial or jurisdictional entity. Native American tribes are jurisdictional entities as well. There have been cases recently in the Supreme Court that have, made it clear that those tribes actually have federal powers of jurisdiction as well on their land, things that the EPA feels like it should control. Native tribes might actually hold that power over the EPA. There's a battle right now happening there. But in terms of finances, Natives are wards of the state, on every single level. There's no real advantage financially that they have. In fact, they have a lot of disadvantages.
What an incredibly complicated and Byzantine Kafkaesque system. I mean, it's really, if I could use any more adjectives about how confusing and it sounds, I would throw them in there.
The way I began to understand it analytically is that African Americans had a relationship with the early colonial and agricultural state, and their relationship was in the value of their bodies. Native Americans had a negative value to the economic engine of the colonies and the early American nation state, and that was in their absence. And there came a point in enlightened American society where wars against Native Americans were no longer socially permissible, although we know the American military will fight wars for a lot of reasons, but usually those wars begin to stop when the political pressure begins to take precedent over the desire to play with toys. So there came a point in enlightened American society where Natives, it wasn't permissible to kill in the way that was prior to 1860. And that has basically begun to reshape the relationship of the Native person to the state. That said, they still don't own the land that they occupy. One of the executive producers, who's one of Lila's colleagues at First Nations, she's part Kiowa from the southeastern Colorado, Nebraska. She's on land that has an oil lease, and that oil lease, I believe, was signed in the early 1900s. The US government can negotiate and does negotiate with corporations on behalf of Native tribes, and they're the ones who have the power. And so the agreement that they negotiated in the early 1900s paid perpetual royalties to people who had these oil leases, but those royalties were based on the price of gasoline or oil at the time the agreements were signed. And so very often, although she's not charged for it, Ade, who's the person I'm talking about, Ade Briones, actually finds that she's got a negative balance every quarter because the cost of pulling out the oil is more than what the company owes her at like 1920s prices. So she's still getting compensated like 2% of what that 1920 barrel of oil cost. And like, that's not capitalism. It's like Native Americans aren't allowed to exist within the capitalistic economy, I believe, unless and until they begin to give up their access to their land.
I don't even. I'm speechless. Maybe it's time to talk about Buffalo. I gather my thoughts on this. I don't mean to sound trite. It's just that there's a lot to take in, and I wonder, and because this is, again, like some of the information, like I'm not saying I'm well versed, and I'm very knowledgeable, but I think that there's a lot of information as we're all learning about, a lot of aspects in the US that, we're not getting the true picture, the full story, and it's slowly coming out. So it's really a lot to absorb. But one of the, actually, it strikes me, Lila, and maybe this is something you could talk about, is as we're seeing increased awareness for Black lives and the Black Lives Matter movement, is any of that awareness of social and racial inequity translating to also embracing Native communities and elevating the challenges faced by Native communities?
Absolutely. Yeah. We're seeing a lot more engagement with our challenges, with our challenges, and just a lot more engagement with our narratives, and the things that we've always been saying. We've seen a lot more engagement with that, like this summer. And the beauty of the Black Lives Matter movement is that it brings up all of the voices that have not been heard. So, I mean, it centers Black voices, but in centering Black voices about police brutality, for example, that also brings in the conversation about how Natives are also extremely, like, we have probably the highest rate of police brutality against our people. So, like, when the Black Lives Matter movement has really brought up this awareness and this consciousness, and amazing Black leaders have connected with amazing Native leaders. So even in my small circles of social justice on the internet, I'm just seeing a lot more of my friends who were not previously engaged with Indigenous issues outside of like listening to me. They're now sort of getting more accustomed to intaking Native analyses of policy, or Native current situations, current actions in Indian country. And so, yes, it's definitely, there's more awareness that's happening, but, there's a lot of momentum that happens with that. And we just want to make sure, like any other movement, that we don't lose that momentum.
Right.
Things can peter out really easily. And for Native people, visibility is fantastic, but it's not useful unless it continues.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm happy to hear that the Black lives and that tide of increased awareness is rise, like Native communities are that's rising for Native communities as well. Let me jump back to our viewers. So just a clarification, Sanjay, when you were talking earlier about the idea of trauma with Native communities and other like white communities, was that Sammy Genshaw that said that, or was that?
Yeah, no, that's wholly, I mean, that's Sammy's perspective.
Okay.
That said, like, I've traveled all over the world. I've traveled all over the US for a lot of different projects. And I've never felt the sort of blatant animosity that is completely apparent in, not all the time, I'm not generalizing, but in
Mm-hmm,
a lot of cities that border Native reservations. I've never seen the displays of really white supremacy that accepted in the ways they are there. Like, I live in New York City, and like somebody might have like a neo-Nazi tattoo on their forearm, but they've just got the self-awareness to roll their sleeves down. But I go into diners in communities, and this isn't just one place, in off-reservation communities, and people will display their
wow.
tattoo in just a regular old diner, and you just go like, it's I couldn't even say it's like being in the 1920s or 1930s. It's just a world in and of
Right.
itself.
Right. Wow, I think that to know that Sammy as a young man like is having that level of deep thinking is really, really remarkable. So do you guys, I want to put out these questions about buffalo and bison. So I don't know who the best person to ask it, or even if we can answer this, but Kate asks, so we are dying to know which is better, beef or buffalo, and why in terms of nutrition. And they're really curious about Elise's work, Elsie's work, I'm sorry.
So in a nutshell, like obviously everyone's watched the movie and they've seen, 63 million buffalo get taken down to 23 individuals. But Fred says something. He says that non-natives like myself would understand the environmental reason to bring back buffalo. And of course, the Great Plains were the third largest carbon sink in the world until settlers began to monocrop it with hybrids, or not hybrids, I should just say in the 1800s, like wheat, corn, things that were cash crops. And they so decimated these majestic grasslands that by the 1920s, there was a dust bowl. There was a dust bowl in an area that 60 years earlier had 6-foot tall grasses for as far as I could see, with roots that went down 6, 8, 12, 18 feet. And so the environmental catastrophe was tremendous. And the buffalo were the apex of that whole ecosystem. But Fred says that for Lakota people, it's a reconnection with their identity. It's a reconnection with the thousands of years that they lived in harmony, in symbiosis with those herds, with their stewarding of those herds, pushing those herds. I mean, there's a ton of actually archaeological evidence of how Native communities around the country opened up passageways in forests, pushed bison through there, and created migratory patterns that took buffalo from Alaska all the way down to Sarasota, Florida. And so spirituality, culture, community, life revolved around this animal. So, because of the USDA restrictions for serving game meat, non-farmable meat like bison, need a lot of land. They're not going to eat from a trough like a cow necessarily will. So Native farmers can't sell their bison into the USDA school lunch programs for the most part on their reservations. Elsie feels like she needs to create a body of science that will prove to government institutions why these foods could be better for American health, because the argument for Native American health doesn't matter to institutions. That said, she found that the lipid content, the lectin content, there's a lot of plants that are completely indigestible to us because of lectins. Those plants have a deep medicinal quality. Compounds, like in the movie with the Gloucester, with the pack rat, one of Twyla's friends mentions that there's medicinal plants in the winter that, Apaches needed, but they actually couldn't prepare because of the poisonous lectins. But in the winter, these little pack rats would eat those, and the compounds would be within their muscle system. So eating those animals help the ingestion of those necessary medicines. And so Elsie understood that there's a certain section of plant life, medicinal plant life, that buffalo can break down in ways that humans can't. But their fat structure and the leanness of everybody who's eaten buffalo knows that the fat's on the outside. The fat doesn't necessarily permeate the actual muscle. So the bison is a lot leaner than cattle is. So she proved that. A lot of people have proven that, but she proved that pretty convincingly.
And George has a follow-up question. Is it true that buffalo don't get sick? And he has, and is it difficult for people to adjust to eating buffalo who may not be used to some meats or diets?
That's a great question. So, cattle, I'm not going to knock cows, because in India, cows are sacred. So this isn't like me hating on cows, but cows were introduced here in the 1400s. They've had 600 years of presence here. Bison have had millions of years of presence here. So bison have developed adaptations to food systems, to disease systems, to pathogens on levels that cattle haven't. And bison have developed behavioral adaptations. If anybody has seen pictures of bison in the snow, their faces are covered in snow. They have these gigantic beards, because in a snowstorm, all the bison will turn towards the snow and face it. And because their faces, their heads are so heavily insulated, the brunt of the weather hits their head. Cattle, on the other hand, actually literally turn the opposite way, expose the less insulated parts, their rear ends, and more often than not, freeze. Bison also have a hoof structure that allows them to run on 20, 30, 40 feet of snow through the Midwest. And it's gotten that deep in South Dakota in the last decade. Cattle literally can't move in snow depths like that. So it's the equivalent, and this is dumb, but it's the equivalent of like putting like a house cat in the Serengeti. It's like, it's just not going to survive. It's all cute and it's going to be pretty, but it's going to be, it's toast. So bison have that deep strength. Now, I'm a vegetarian, but when I go to tribal communities, especially ones that consider certain meats or certain animals as elemental to their creation stories, like in the Yurok creation story, the creator asked the animal world to help human beings survive. And the creator asked which species would volunteer. The only species that volunteered were the salmon. And so there's that kinship spiritually between the Yurok people and salmon. Of course, with the buffalo people, the Lakota, they've got that same relationship with buffalo. So when I've been served salmon in salmon country, I eat it because, you know, it's like, you have to. And so I've had buffalo as a vegetarian, no problem digesting it. You know, for people who have eaten buffalo, again, one of the reasons why buffalo are so incredibly healthy and strong is because they have a really thick layer of fat directly under their skin. The fat doesn't go into their musculature the way it does with cattle. And so buffalo meat is incredibly lean. And when I've had bison burgers, for example, it's like, meh, without mayonnaise and cheese because there's no fat. But I've had canned buffalo, which seems like it shouldn't taste good because it seems pretty industrial, even if it's made at home. But with the canned buffalo, they put in the gristle, they put in the chunks of fat, and through the pressure and through the heat, that fat is broken down. It kind of becomes a confit, it's rendered, and it's amazing. It's like buffalo meat mixed or cooked in buffalo fat is absolutely phenomenal. The protein structures are so similar to any other type of meat that I don't think anybody who can eat meat in general would have any issues with buffalo meat.
Fascinating. All right, there's a question about cinematography. Josh asks, the cinematography was beautiful. How did you connect with cinematographer Renan Ozturk, who is based here in Utah, is known for his extreme mountaineering films primarily, but it has an amazing eye. So how did you connect with Renan?
So my first film, Food Chains, which you guys so kindly screened, was shot by was the first film shot by an outdoor photographer named Forrest Woodward, who shoots for Patagonia, Nat Geo, and that whole world. And that's how I met Renan. Renan was unique though, because although he hadn't spent much time with indigenous communities in America, as a climber, he spent a lot of time with indigenous communities in Nepal. And the reason why I point that out is because unlike 99.99999% of the climbers who go to Nepal and who use the help of the Sherpas, Renan actually learned how to speak Nepali and how to speak some of the Sherpa tongues. And so he has this sensitivity to what it's like to be a good guest as opposed to a bad guest. And so Renan and I met each other a year later. We began talking about this project. And, we shot in some pretty inhospitable locations. Like when we shot with Elsie, even though Elsie and Fred were just dressed in denim jackets, it was -14 to -20, not counting the wind chill. And I mean, he shoots in Arctic and Himalayan climate. So that was not a big deal for him.
Right.
At the same time, it's like, we shot where we shot with the Ancestral Guard, was miles away from power. We were actually, submersing ourselves in rivers to get certain shots. And I knew that he'd be completely down for that. But that said, in addition to being an exceptional cinematographer, it's always critical to me as a filmmaker to have, especially making films where trust is paramount and that trust needs to last through the end of the project. It's paramount to work with people who are utterly humble and who can just disappear in a room. And Renan did that. But the one thing I think Lila will attest to is that social media in Indian country is like bigger than social media outside of Indian country. Like Facebook for Native people it's way bigger than you'd ever imagine. Like it's like people will go like, good morning. And like 70 people will go, good morning, good morning, good morning. It's like they use it to check in. It's like, it's this whole different beast. I think they prop up the Facebook stock in ways that I think only Zuckerberg knows. That said, Renan on Instagram, when we started Filming Gather, had 600,000 followers. Now he has 1 million. And that makes him more important than Brad Pitt with many Native American youth. It's like seeing that verified check mark, seeing the 1 million followers. And he also has access to Nat Geo's Instagram account, which has more than 100 million followers. And so it wasn't a quid pro quo, but every trip we went on, he would take a few stunning photos of cast members and throw them up on the Nat Geo site. So much so that Elsie Dubray had a private Instagram account with like 300 friends before we started, but she was getting so many friend requests that she had to make her Instagram account public. The Ancestral Guard started with 0 followers, and because of Renan's incessant promotion through Nat Geo and on his own channel, they built up more than 5,000 or 6,000 followers within a matter of a few weeks. So he brought a lot of very valuable things to the film in so many ways.
Yeah, wow. That's amazing. So, I mean, I guess that's an interesting sort of question about social media and how that's like, is it, it seems like in Native and Indian country, it's bringing communities closer together, that it really is a platform, allowing people to connect, even if they are, well, like for many, but, it seems that, Native communities are also much tighter, and even if, and does that sort of help? I guess how do I want to frame this, is that seeing the community come together, so for Nephi's event, for the opening of the cafe, and and just the fact that it's a very there's not a huge population density, whereas it's, I don't know what I'm really trying to say. I guess I'm just thinking about how social media is being used in other countries more so than in the US, where it's about, I don't know, I'm not on social media, so I should probably stop talking about this, but it's great that there's a positive use for it and that Native communities are able to stay more connected to it. I have my own opinions on that, but I won't share it. But I do want to say, somebody's asking where the film's available. It's available on iTunes, it's available on Amazon, and it's available on Vimeo for if you're not in the US. Is that correct, Sanjay?
Yeah, and I should say, it's been a challenge I thought it would be a challenge to release a film, in a pandemic. My other films were lucky to have theatrical tours and get the kind of resulting press that brought. But for us, the social media has been incredible. First of all, people are watching more stuff now than ever before, and we're not competing with other, tentpole movies the way we normally would. And so many people have gotten behind this movie on social media that it's been really phenomenal. So much so that, even though I didn't realize they offered contracts as low as they offered us, we got a contract from Netflix. So the film
That's amazing.
It'll be on Netflix March, April, or May, somewhere around there. But as people might know, they don't really acquire projects in the way that they used to, and they certainly don't acquire like small budget films about Indian country that weren't made for non-natives. Like, we don't have the kind of drama and trauma that people kind of expect from films about Native Americans. But it was really because there was just a groundswell of people online saying, we need a movie that's got hope. We want to learn, we want to understand the context of injustice, but we also want to feel good at the end. We want to feel good that there are good people in this world. We want to feel like the youth are doing things that are going to end up lifting all of us up. And we want to feel that despite 400 years of colonization, the original people are still here and doing their own thing in beautiful, beautiful ways. And that was all because of social media.
Amazing. I wish I could retract what I was trying to say earlier and be a little more gracious for social media. Lila, I'd like to give you the last word. Is there anything you'd like to share, or like anything you want to put out there to the audience?
I mean, this is just a beautiful opportunity for me. I'm a Native youth, and I have to say that, like, social media as a Native youth has been incredibly helpful in making me feel less alone. I'm half Navajo and I'm half Jewish, and I never thought I would meet another Navajo Jewish person in this entire world. I thought me and my sister were the only ones, but I found community through social media. And then, I found Elsie on social media, I think before we even dropped Gather, and we were able to connect, even though I had no idea, we had no connection other than maybe the film. But the ability for us to connect as Native people is crucial. I would have never known about Elsie if it weren't for the film, but I also could find her probably on contact lists or like Facebook lists of my many friends on Facebook. And so the way that community is built in Indian country is it's becoming so clear that it's integral to my existence as a Native youth. And the only way that I think Native youth can do such amazing work as these kids in the film is because of the strong community that we have. And this film, and also like having so many people watch and ask questions and having amazing, knowledgeable, like co-conspirators like Sanjay, like this is so empowering for Native youth to see this. And this has been an important thing for me to see, because it makes me feel like my work and what I'm going to do in the future will actually matter. So like I have this community of other Native people, but it feels like now it's starting to grow out to people who are not Native. And that's also really, really special. So I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this panel, and also just witness people who are interested in these stories and people who are invested in these stories, because that's touching and special for me and inspirational for me too.
Well, thank you, Lila. It was our pleasure to have you join us, really. And Sanjay, you as well. Like an amazing film, and like I said, really moving and touching. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time this evening to join us and have this conversation. And Lila, if we can sign up to be co-conspirators, I want to be on that list, and I think I'm going to say that for some of the other viewers out there as well. But thank you both for being here, and we wish you all the best with this film and future endeavors.
Thanks so much, Patrick. And Lila, I need to stop doing these panels. You should just do them all. Great.
I'm a busy student.
Yeah, we need to find a way to bring you back, Lila. We'll think on that one. Figure out how to bring you back.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Have a good night.